Thank you very much. Ambassador Jack Lew, I had a debate with my staff today because when I saw the schedule of the conference in Hebrew, it was written there, Ambassador Yaakov Lev. And they said, what are you talking about? This is Jack Lew. I think it's important that our audience will know that you are both Jack Lew, but also Yaakov Lev. So thank you very much for honoring us and coming to the conference, actually for the closure of the first day. I know that you are marking right now the first year of your activity as the ambassador in Israel, and what a year they brought you to. I think it's the toughest year for an ambassador, American ambassador, to be in Israel. And first of all, I would like to thank you for supporting Israel and conducting your job, difficult job, I have to say, for the benefit of Israel and United States, and for the tightening the strategic connection between Israel and United States. And thank you for coming to the conference. So I would like to start with a general question. How would you assess the strategic ties and relations nowadays between Israel and United States?
First, thank you for having me here tonight. And when I saw the date of the conference, I wasn't quite sure how we were all going to get together for a conversation on normal subjects as we mark a year of this terrible hostage crisis after the brutal attacks of October 7th. And you said to me, we have to get together, we have to keep going, and we have to keep doing the things that we did before. And you couldn't be more right. We have to remember, but we have to continue. And I applaud you and everyone here for keeping on with the important work that you do here and not missing a beat. I think the ties between the United States and Israel are deep and enduring, and I would not worry about the moments when there are disagreements. Friends, family members don't always see things the same way. Doesn't mean they're not family, it doesn't mean they're not friends. Israel's never had as close a friend as the United States. I don't think the United States has ever done for another country what it's done for Israel over this last year, and I'm proud to say that. As President Biden said right after the attacks on October 7th, the United States has Israel's back, and that hasn't changed. I don't believe it will change. The fact that we see things differently is perhaps an obvious understatement. As a world superpower, we look at things through the lens of a superpower. As a fragile democracy in this region, Israel looks at things through its own lens, which is how does it project its deterrent strength at every moment that it needs to. I think the value of us going back and forth on the things that we sometimes see differently is you get to a better answer when you think about things strategically from both perspectives. And I think we've added that to the way many of the tough decisions have been made, whether it's on humanitarian assistance or on how to prosecute elements of the war. We're at a crucial moment right now, and I think the fact that the United States stands unquestionably behind Israel is crucially important. And one of the things that we have to do is not allow differences of opinion to become daylight between us. And fear of daylight can't become a fear of giving our best advice, because we wouldn't be the close friend that we are if we held back. And I think the one thing I fear is over the coming years, there's a new generation that doesn't have the historical perspective of the generations before. I mean, President Biden, by age, will be the last president that remembers a world without the state of Israel. And that's a powerful historical reality. And as things go forward, there needs to be outreach to a young generation where the core values that tie Israel and the United States together, that make us so close, are going to need some attention. And not to just assume everyone understands it, because they didn't grow up in a world where Israel came into being and was a fragile new democracy under constant threat. And Israel today sometimes appears like a superpower, even though it's so small. I say to people, per person and per square mile, this is the most complicated place on earth, I think.
You rightly so said that President Biden gets it. He, I would say, is probably a Zionist the way I see him and his activity. But this is a very difficult year and very difficult time for President Biden, because it's a presidential election year. And I would like to ask you, does the fact that we are so close to the election day, does this has an impact on the American commitment and support to Israel nowadays, or not?
I think it makes much less of a difference in Washington than it does here. I have not been in a single conversation where our decision has turned on where we were in the election cycle. There were moments when President Biden was still a candidate for re-election when you might have thought that we would change policy because things were becoming challenging in the prospective upcoming election. It didn't make a difference then, and it doesn't make a difference now. I think the president has at every point done what he thinks is right, and I think he will continue to. There's no question but that in an election year, people get very focused on the election, and the next month will be a time when America is very consumed with its own domestic affairs. But I don't know that there's another issue that will compete for as much attention as the issues here. And I know even over these last days, these last weeks, that's certainly been the case.
And as you said, this is a deep ties and commitment from the side of United States to Israel. And it used to be a bipartisan approach towards Israel. Do you believe, and we're talking about a very close and tight elections, do you believe that regardless who would be the next president, this connection will sustain and maybe even become stronger?
I think it's crucially important that support in the United States for Israel remain a bipartisan commitment, and that Israel work vigilantly to maintain bipartisan support. There's going to be some challenges to a pro-Israel position from the right and the left. There's going to be questions raised about the scope of U.S. international commitments. There's going to be questions raised about some of the policies that Israel pursues. But if you look in the middle, there's probably 70% core support for Israel. On both sides, it's about the same probably. You want that to be a unified bipartisan policy. And I would just caution that if there's ever a thought that it is helpful for Israel to be closer to one side than the other, I have thought for the almost 50 years that I've been around public life that that would be a mistake, and I think that today.
Can you spell out for us what are the vital interests of United States in the current conflict, and what do you think Israel should do in order to support those vital interests of United States?
The United States' support for Israel is fundamentally rooted in our commitment to the security of the state of Israel, our belief that having the partnership with Israel is good for both of our countries, and that the historical relationship is just of a very special nature. I think in the world we live in today, with the United States being the world's biggest superpower, but with challenges coming from other places, Iran in this region is a real threat to stability in the region, and the U.S. has a security interest in there being stability in this region. And Israel is an important ally in the region. I think there are many other countries in the region that share an interest in that stability. And one of the things that I think has been really important in the last few years is the Abraham Accords that were developed in the last administration, the efforts that we've been pursuing to expand the countries which have not just business relations but diplomatic ties to Israel should grow, and we think it should include Saudi Arabia. When I agreed to accept this post in July, I didn't have any way of knowing October 7th would happen. The mission that I came here committed to doing was completing the normalization process with Saudi Arabia, because that's something that's of huge strategic importance to Israel, to the United States, and to the region. That's going to be just as true, for the rest of the time I'm here, notwithstanding the fact that I've been here for a year of the war, and coming through this crisis and finding a way to put that back on track is crucially important.
Once I visited the Pentagon, some colleagues in the Pentagon, and they asked me, what is the difference between Israeli strategical thinking and American strategical thinking? The first answer that I gave them, Israel doesn't have strategic thinking at all. But leave this aside, I said, it's like the difference between an American air carrier and a speedboat. I said, what do you mean? How do you compare the two? I said, look, United States, it's like an American air carrier. It thinks strategically. If they have a problem, they would analyze what they want to be in 5 years from now, and from then to go back and to understand what is the immediate move that they need to do. Israel doesn't think along those lines, probably because we have so many immediate threats to deal with. We are the best, in my view, tacticians on earth, but the worst strategic thinkers in the world. The good news, I said, that there is a good combination between the two, because the speedboat needs the strategical support of the air carrier, and the air carrier needs the speedboat to do the slalom and protect the immediate surrounding of the air carrier. I'm asking that because I wonder, what is the end goal or the end strategy that you think that should be, and does United States has a strategy of ending the conflict that they would like to see fulfilled?
So I think in the last half a year, we've seen the value of the strategic aircraft carrier in real life. Having our ability to place our strategic aircraft carriers has provided a deterrence that's made an enormous difference in the calculus that other strategic decisions makers are making in other capitals. I think the truth is, we put a huge value on strategic thinking, and you can say that's the luxury of being a country that's not at immediate threat. But it also goes back to the character of being a superpower. We have to think strategically, because when we make decisions, it can have enormous impacts, not just on our country today, but on the region and the world for a very long time to come. I think Israel has been in a fight for survival for most of its life, but it has enormous capabilities and power in the region, and increasingly has to take into consideration strategic, not just tactical outcomes, because they too can have outsized impact. And we're sitting here in a week when people are weighing those kinds of choices in terms of thinking through what would be an appropriate response to the awful attack last Tuesday night with 200 ballistic missiles. Mm-hmm. I mean, everyone in this room who was here was in a shelter because almost everybody in the country was in a shelter. And that can't be tolerated, but in responding to it, one has to take into consideration strategic considerations as well. And those are the kinds of conversations we do have with each other, and those kinds of conversations are going on even this weekend. Do we have a strategy for the end of the conflict and the time beyond? We do have a strategy. Time is testing it in terms of whether it could be completed in the time that we're here. You know, I mean, the Biden administration will end in January. So what I'm going to say sounds perhaps a bit unrealistic given the shortness of time, but I don't think it's any less relevant in terms of being the right strategic course. Coming out of this conflict, Israel needs to be safer in the region, not just because it has the military power to confront every threat, but because there's a new diplomatic agreement in the region that provides stable long-term security. I mean, I talked about normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia. That is something that would be the biggest defeat for Iran and for Hamas coming out of this war. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a challenge getting there in the next few months, but it's not impossible. I was more optimistic a few months ago than I am now, not because the mission is unachievable, but just because time on our, in our term is coming short. I think looking at Gaza, there has to be a way of rebuilding Gaza in the day after, where there's an alternative to Hamas as a governing body for Gaza, where Palestinians are making decisions and governing themselves without Hamas. That's going to be hard, but we've said almost from the beginning of the conflict that you have to be thinking about the day after now, because it is hard. I think people are thinking about it more now in the last few months than they were at the very beginning of the war. But it's going to be a pretty heavy lift. If it's done right, it can tie countries in the region together. Mm-hmm. If it's Israel on its own, it will look like occupation. And that is strategically a very big difference. So I don't actually think the government here wants to be in the position of being in Gaza, but getting to a different reality in the future is going to require not just military power, but enormous diplomatic work in the region and in the broader world, both to provide material support and financial support, but also legitimacy to what comes next. I think the ultimate objective that we have would be not just to deal with the resolution of Gaza, but to figure out a solution to the underlying tension between Israel and Palestinians, and a way for Palestinians to not be attracted to parties, to terrorist groups like Hamas. That means there has to be a better future. Now, today, tomorrow is not the time for that. But over the horizon, there has to be a willingness to talk about it. It's connected to Saudi Arabia, because to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia will involve having to make a decision to embark on that conversation, so that at the end of a process, there's a better hope for Palestinians' autonomy. And the word state as an ultimate goal will have to be something that people can tolerate. Right now, I'm told most people can't tolerate it. I would actually say even today, if the price of tolerating talking about a Palestinian state over the horizon is normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia, that's a deal people should take tomorrow, because one is of huge strategic importance and value and enduring value, and the other is embarking on a process that ultimately has to happen anyway, because there's no other solution.
You've mentioned that we don't know who would win the elections in the United States, but we do know that President Biden is not a candidate. Therefore, he will not be in this position in January. And we are getting into what I would call maybe the twilight zone between the election day and January. And do you think that this period of time is more fragile, is more dangerous? Maybe the Biden term don't is weaker during those period of time?
I think anyone who makes the assumption that until his last day in office, President Biden won't keep his commitments and follow through is making a big mistake. I think the extent to which he is focused on what is going on here the decisions that are being made here, the commitments that he is making to people here. It is not casual, it is serious, and we have a visit here today by the commander of our CENTCOM. He'll only have one commander-in-chief at a time, and people should not have any notion that there will be an eye taken off the ball or hesitancy to follow through as we need to. I think the fact that attention will shift to the future is normal. There will be a transition process. People will start thinking about who are going to be in jobs in the next administration. But you govern until the inauguration. And the area in which that lasts till literally the last minute is foreign policy. And there's no issue that's higher on the agenda than the issues here today.
No doubt that President Biden is very affirmative in his support to Israel in these troubled times. But there are at least two Iranian proxies that directly challenge American assets. And I refer to the Houthis and the Shiite militias in Iraq, maybe even Syria, that attacks American targets. And if I may say so, I don't see a decisive activity coming from American side in order maybe to eliminate those two threats which are posing a direct threat to the United States.
I think just this weekend, these last few days, we had a rather substantial military operation in Yemen, which we believe is a proportional response to the threats that we've been facing. We're very careful to have proportional responses. We're not looking to expand the conflicts that involve us. We practice what we preach. When we urge avoiding escalation, it's because we believe in trying to resolve things without getting into regional war, without making the situation more dangerous. And I have found it surprising in the case of the Houthis that it's taken us as long as it has for the rest of the world to be concerned about closing down a shipping channel that's roughly 20% of the world's commerce. It's almost unimaginable that it would have taken months for that to become something that was a matter of real international concern. We've been the ones who, from the very beginning, have been in the waters when there were Mayday calls for support. We're not alone anymore. That's good. But I think it relates to the way other countries have made their policies with regard to Israel, and when it was viewed as something that the Houthis were doing because of Israel, it took a little longer for the reality of what they were doing to be taken as seriously as we took it from the very beginning. So we're committed to defending our interests. There's nothing that is a higher priority for an American president and American government than protecting U.S. citizens. While we have fought zealously to achieve a hostage deal and to relieve all of the hostages, our first commitment has to be that we have American hostages. We still have 7 Americans who are in captivity. Mm-hmm. We're not going to rest until every one of them is back home. The ones who are living and the ones who deserve respectful, burial.
Shifting from the proxies to the head of the snake, i.e. Iran, we are minutes, hours, days, weeks before what seems to be an Israeli retaliation against Iran as an outcome of the attack that Iran attacked Israel on the 1st of October. What do you think should be the Israeli considerations in planning and preparing and executing such a retaliation operation, if at all?
So I'm not going to speculate on decisions that are being considered literally right now by the security cabinet here, where there are private conversations going on between our governments about the best way to proceed. I think what we've made clear publicly is that it's important for this not to escalate into a regional war. We've made some public comments, the president has made some public comments that suggest the things that we think create the greatest risk of things spiraling. On the other hand, we haven't said that Israel should just tolerate having 200 ballistic missiles shot at it in a little over an hour, even if it was 2 hours. I mean, the remarkable defenses, the air defenses that we together have executed to protect Israel from these attacks in no way should diminish how serious it is to fire weapons like this, across a long area with huge warheads. There was a picture in one of the news stories of the piece of a ballistic missile that the people looked like, like ants around the portion of the ballistic missile that was sitting on the ground. They're enormous. With huge warheads, they can do enormous damage. So the fact that the air defenses have worked to, for the most part, protect civilian populations is not a reason to say that it's not a huge threat. It is a huge threat. At the same time, the response shouldn't create a larger war and a war that becomes a regional war, because that would be worse we think it would be worse for Israel, for the region, and for the United States. So there's a balance that has to be struck, and I'm going to leave the details to private conversations.
Yeah, so probably you won't be very happy with answering my next question, which is President Biden said loud and clear that the United States would not let Iran becoming a nuclear state. And some people, at least in Israel, believes that this is a golden opportunity now, because we have the legitimacy, Israel has the legitimacy to retaliate against Iran, and maybe this is the time to eliminate or at least damage their nuclear efforts in Iran.
So I'm not going to speculate on what Israel can and can't do on its own. When I was closer to these issues of the nuclear program in Iran, when I was Treasury Secretary, I had pretty detailed knowledge of what could and couldn't happen. And at the time, I thought the United States had to make its own decision whether it would get into a war with Iran. And I think that's still the case. Israel has to make its own decisions with the capabilities that it has, and the United States has to retain its ability and right to make decisions for itself. And the challenge is a nuclear Iran is a big threat. I spent many years of my life putting sanctions on Iran and doing enough harm to Iran that Iran was willing to get into a negotiation to take serious steps to slow down its nuclear program and to provide an opportunity to not have a nuclear Iran. We're now in a point in time that's 10 years beyond that. And it's harder now than it was then. But that doesn't mean that the decision to go to war has become an easy one, or that destroying Iran's nuclear program is something that should be treated as a decision to make because last week was a successful week. It's about strategy, not tactics.
Shifting gears to the American efforts to reach an agreement in order to free the hostages. You have mentioned that you're still working on that. You're really wishing to see the day that those hostages would be free, American hostages and other hostages. But we expected to have a new Biden deal that will be put on the table, and maybe with a firm message coming from President Biden to the two sides, take it or leave it. And it seems that this is evaporated through the events that happened since then in the Middle East. So my question is, did the United States exhausted its efforts to suggest a deal? And does a stages deal, as was discussed, 3 stages. The first would be humanitarian, and then the rest too. Maybe seems to be irrelevant right now. And instead of that, the American deal should bring to the table an overall deal that will include the cessation of the war in Gaza and starting the day after activity of rebuilding Gaza.
I don't think there's a way to fully describe how much effort the United States has put into achieving a hostage deal and a ceasefire. As Roger was saying as I walked in, it's from the President of the United States through his whole senior national security team, all of us. We're never going to give up. The fact that we're at a moment now that is not feeling like a deal will be today or tomorrow does not mean that we're going to accept the fact that there's an alternative to ultimately freeing the hostages. I don't think there is a way to free them other than through negotiation and through working on it and not giving up. We saw the horrible execution of 6 hostages, some of whom were on lists that the negotiators were going over to be exchanged if there were a deal. It was a terrible betrayal of trust, even in a world of very little trust. You're negotiating who is a humanitarian hostage, and then they're killed. And I think where we are now is a moment where there aren't any great signs that Hamas is interested in a deal right now. But that hopefully will change, and we'll only find the moment when it changes by pushing and pushing and pushing. Israel has maintained military pressure. Sinwar does not want any of us to know where he is, so it's not even easy to have a conversation. But we remain committed to finding avenues to continue pushing. You ask, should the phase deal be discarded? I'm not prepared to discard the phase deal until I have confidence that there's an alternative that's more likely to succeed. I am not persuaded that we're at a moment where all the hostages are going to be released by Hamas, or that Israel will comply with withdraw all troops from Gaza today or tomorrow. So I would be careful not to discard the phase deal until you're very confident that the other. All of us would be happy if all the hostages could be released tomorrow, and if there could be an end to the war. But if you don't have confidence that the two sides will agree to that, the phase deal is a way to make progress. Mm-hmm. And if any opening appears, as it might, as the situation changes, I think the likelihood of Hamas thinking that they're going to get a global support or regional support, to come in directly on their behalf is probably not higher now than it was a week ago. They don't know if Hezbollah can or if it wants to. It didn't want to before. It didn't jump in the full bore way that they wanted them to in October or in April. And Iran is in a place where it's now trying in its own way to figure out how to avoid a regional war. Hopefully that will create some further openings in the very near future.
So you believe that the Amos Hochstein deal in the north is still viable and might be...
Look, I think what happened in the last few weeks is that the possibility of having a diplomatic solution in the north, apart from a deal in Gaza, is now very much a possibility at the end of the operations in Lebanon. It's not a certainty, but there's a pathway there. And that will put more pressure on Hamas and on Sinwar. The horrible reality is, as Ambassador Carson said, is that Hamas gets a vote. It's not just a vote. They get to make the decision. Do they let the hostages go? And obviously they shouldn't have taken them, and they should have let them go a year ago. And we have to keep pushing to find the moment. What we can't do is give up. Because if we give up, that just is the end of hope for them to come back. And we're not going to give up. We're not going to give up today, not tomorrow, not for as long as it takes.
So talking about hope, the last two questions I have for you. One is, can we still hope for a normalization with Saudi Arabia, or this initiative is now recent history?
I think it is very much in the interest of Saudi Arabia, Israel, the region, and the United States. So I think there's still a pathway there. I had hoped that it would be something that we could complete before January. There's still a small pathway, but we're not there today. If the issues in Gaza could be resolved, if Gaza was quiet, and if the situation in Lebanon ends up in a diplomatic solution, it's not impossible to get the Saudi deal across the finish line. But time is not our friend. You know, there will be an ongoing conversation, and that doesn't have to end at the end of the Biden administration. But the best time to do it is right now. And it's taken longer than we wanted to get to the point where there was a hostage deal and a ceasefire in Gaza. And we're now in a situation where I don't know exactly how long the discussions will take after the military operations in Lebanon. But I'm an optimist. I think both of those are going to ultimately be the pathway ahead. And if we don't complete the work, we will leave it in a place where someone else can pick it up and complete it because it's kind of set up and ready to go.
So that leads me to the final question. Is the ambassador of United States in Israel that concludes his first year, what gives you hope, if at all, to the future of the region, of Israel, and the Israeli-American relationship?
Even in the darkness of this year and the darkness of the day of this first anniversary, there's a lot to take hope from. Seeing the resilience in this country, how people have come together to help people who are neighbors and friends and people who are total strangers, sacrificing and risking their own well-being. It's inspirational to see just normal people come together. Governments sometimes should take lessons, I feel this way in my own country as well, from the goodness that just regular citizens can bring to bear. Israel and the United States are as close as countries can be, and that is an enduring relationship. I think the future that we've been talking about for the last hour are strategic opportunities that aren't that shouldn't be squandered and aren't going to happen unless people make them happen. It takes leaders to make hard decisions. It takes leaders to convince their citizens why hard decisions are a good idea. This is not easy. It hasn't been easy for the history of Israel. And there's a moment, an inflection point, where I hope that leaders rise to the occasion and that citizens demand leadership from their leaders. And that's going to be a test here, like it is in every democracy, our own included.
So Ambassador Jack Lew, or with the Hebrew name Yaakov Lev, thank you so much for coming to the conference. Thank you so much for sharing with us your thoughts, your concerns, and your hopes. And thank you for everything you personally do for Israel and what Biden administration and the American people do for Israel. Thank you very much.
Very good to be with you.
Thank you, Mr. President.